Chicago winters were merciless beasts with ice for teeth. Elowen knew this better than most, as she huddled beneath the old freight bridge on the south side, her thin frame shaking against the unforgiving concrete. The temperature had plummeted below zero, turning breath to fog and dreams to frost. At 18, she was officially too old for the foster system that had shuffled her through 17 different homes since age 4. None of them had ever felt like home, just temporary shelters where she existed as a ghost, passing through other people's lives. The system had spat her out 3 months ago, with nothing but a backpack of meager possessions and hollow well-wishes. "You've always been strong, Ellie," her last social worker had said, the woman's eyes not quite meeting hers. "You'll figure it out." But strength wasn't shelter, and determination couldn't keep you warm when the Chicago wind cut through your bones like a surgeon's knife. Elowen pulled her only blanket, a faded blue wool thing she'd found in a church donation box, tighter around her shoulders. It was her most precious possession now, the thin barrier between survival and the deadly kiss of hypothermia. Her fingers, red and cracked, clutched the fabric as she hummed softly to herself, the melody rising in the frozen air like a prayer. Music had always been her sanctuary. When homes changed and faces blurred, melodies remained constant companions. Her voice, raw and haunting, was the one gift no one could take from her. She'd discovered it at age 8, singing to a stray cat behind the garbage cans of her 5th foster home. The animal had stopped, transfixed, and approached her without fear. It was the first time she'd felt truly seen. Since then, animals had always responded to her in ways humans rarely did, with immediate trust and recognition. Dogs would cross streets to greet her, birds would land near her outstretched fingers, and stray cats would emerge from shadowy hiding places when she called. This connection felt like magic in a life that had offered little wonder. As the night deepened and the temperature plunged further, Elowen's humming faded to shallow breaths. Sleep was dangerous in such cold, but exhaustion was pulling her under. Her eyelids grew heavy as the distant sounds of the city, car horns, sirens, the rattle of the elevated train, blended into a discordant lullaby. Then, cutting through the urban symphony, came a sound that jolted her awake, a high, anguished cry that wasn't quite human, but carried unmistakable pain. Elowen sat up, her senses suddenly alert. The sound came again, a distressed animal in agony. Without hesitation, she rose on cramping legs, keeping the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders as she stepped from beneath the bridge's meager shelter. The night air attacked immediately, burning her lungs and stinging her exposed skin. Snowflakes swirled in the glow of distant streetlights, transforming the industrial landscape into something almost ethereal. Her feet, protected only by worn sneakers, crunched through the fresh snow as she followed the sound. It led her along the frozen riverbank, past abandoned warehouses and graffiti-covered walls, through a tangle of overgrown brush that tore at her clothes. The cries grew louder, more desperate. When she pushed through the final barrier of frost-coated brambles, Elowen froze, her breath catching in her throat. There, illuminated by the weak moonlight filtering through clouds, stood the most magnificent horse she had ever seen. A thoroughbred stallion with a coat the color of burnished copper, his powerful frame trembling violently in the cold. A perfect white star marked his forehead like a blessing, contrasting with the rest of his gleaming bay coat. His legs, slender and elegant despite bearing shallow cuts and scrapes, shifted nervously on the icy ground. Steam rose from his nostrils in frantic clouds as he pawed at the frozen earth. He was beautiful, he was terrified, and he was dying of cold. Elowen approached slowly, her voice soft as she began to hum the melody that had always calmed frightened creatures. The horse's ears flicked toward her, his dark eyes wild with fear and pain. "Hey there," she whispered, keeping her movements deliberate and smooth. "What happened to you, beautiful? Where did you come from?" The stallion snorted, backing away a few steps before something in his energy shifted. His nostrils flared as he caught her scent, and his massive head lowered slightly, studying her with intelligent eyes. "I won't hurt you," Elowen promised, extending her hand palm up. "I know what it's like to be lost and scared." Minutes passed in this delicate dance until, remarkably, the horse lowered his head and allowed her fingers to brush his velvet muzzle. The touch sent electricity through her. Connection, understanding, trust. She saw then how badly he was shivering, how his magnificent coat was dusted with snow, how his cuts needed tending. Without thinking, Elowen unwound the blanket from her own shoulders. The cold attacked immediately, biting through her thin sweatshirt and jeans, but she didn't hesitate. With careful movements, she approached the horse's side and gently draped the blue wool over his back. "You need this more than I do," she said, her voice catching as her body began to tremble from the exposure. "Don't worry. I'll figure something out." The horse remained still as she secured the blanket, then turned his proud head to look at her with something that felt impossibly like gratitude. As if understanding the magnitude of her sacrifice, he shuffled closer to her, creating a wall against the whistling wind. In that moment, despite the brutal cold, despite her growling stomach and uncertain future, Elowen felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. This magnificent creature needed her, and somehow, she needed him too. "Ashfall," she whispered, the name coming to her unbidden as snowflakes melted against his warm breath. "I think I'll call you Ashfall." Dawn broke across Chicago's skyline, painting the frozen city in shades of pink and gold that belied the deadly cold. Elowen hadn't slept. Her body ached from shivering, but adrenaline and determination had kept her moving through the night, staying close to Ashfall's warm bulk. The horse hadn't left her side, seeming to understand their unlikely alliance. Together, they'd found temporary shelter beneath a collapsed loading dock behind an abandoned warehouse, huddled against the bitter wind as Elowen worked through their impossible situation. A horse in Chicago, a homeless girl with nothing to offer but compassion. It was madness, but she couldn't abandon him. "We need to move you somewhere safer," she murmured, stroking Ashfall's neck as the first fingers of daylight revealed the extent of his injuries. The cuts weren't deep, but infection in this cold could be deadly. "Somewhere people won't see you." Her mind raced through the city's geography, cataloguing hiding spots she'd discovered during months of homelessness. Most were barely adequate for a human, let alone a 1,000-pound horse. Then she remembered the forgotten community garden in Pilsen. She'd stumbled upon it weeks ago while seeking shelter from rain, an overgrown oasis hidden behind an abandoned tenement building, shielded from view by old tarps, rusted fencing, and the general disinterest of a city always looking upward, never inward. There was a dilapidated shed, too small for Ashfall but usable for supplies. Most importantly, there was space, relative privacy, and patches of grass that had somehow survived beneath the snow. The journey would be perilous, nearly 2 miles through a waking city, avoiding main streets, crowds, and the authorities who would surely separate them. But they had no choice. "Ready for an adventure, boy?" she asked, retrieving her blanket from his back and folding it carefully into her backpack. She would need it tonight, but for now, movement would keep them both warm. Leading a horse through Chicago required strategy, patience, and more than a little luck. Elowen chose their path carefully. Service alleys, empty lots, the gaps between buildings too narrow for cars. They moved in bursts, waiting in shadows between movements, Elowen constantly scanning for threats or witnesses. Ashfall followed her with surprising trust, responding to her whispered commands and gentle touches as if they'd been partners for years. When he startled at the rattling elevated train overhead, she sang softly until his twitching muscles relaxed. When they needed to cross a more exposed area, she timed their movements with the rhythm of traffic lights and passing trucks. Twice they nearly encountered police, once when a patrol car cruised slowly down an alley they'd just exited, and again when an officer on foot paused at the entrance to an empty lot they were crossing. Each time Ashfall seemed to sense her tension, remaining preternaturally still until danger passed. The journey took hours. Elowen's hunger grew from a dull ache to sharp pangs that doubled her over, but she pushed forward, speaking encouragingly to Ashfall when his steps faltered. "Just a little further," she promised as the afternoon shadows lengthened. "We're almost there." When they finally reached the hidden garden, slipping through a gap in the fence where rusty metal had pulled away from concrete posts, Elowen nearly collapsed with relief. The space was wild and overgrown, but the high walls of surrounding buildings blocked the worst of the wind, and patches of ground remained clear of snow beneath the canopy of dormant trees. "Welcome home," she said, guiding Ashfall toward a sheltered corner where tarps from an abandoned construction project hung between fence posts and tree branches, creating a crude but effective windbreak. Her first priority was water. She found an old rain barrel, its contents still liquid beneath a thin crust of ice. Breaking the surface with a rock, she filled a discarded bucket and brought it to Ashfall, who drank greedily. Food was more challenging. Elowen's own stomach gnawed painfully, but Ashfall's need was greater. She ventured out alone, returning an hour later with armfuls of discarded vegetables from a market's dumpster and scraps of hay from where tourist carriages gathered near downtown. It wasn't nearly enough, but it would keep him alive for tonight. As dusk fell, Elowen curled against Ashfall's side beneath her reclaimed blanket, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Her own hunger remained unsatisfied, but seeing him eat had brought its own comfort. "We'll figure this out," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Tomorrow will be better." Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by cold, hunger, and the strange noises of their urban sanctuary. Yet somehow, pressed against Ashfall's warm bulk, with her hand resting on his neck, Elowen felt safer than she had in months. They were two strays now, protecting each other against a world that had no place for either of them. Morning arrived with pale winter sunlight and a new challenge, a presence at the garden's edge, watching them with unreadable eyes. The man stood motionless at the garden's entrance, his weathered face impassive as he regarded the improbable pair before him. He was elderly, perhaps 70, with silver hair cropped close to his scalp and eyes that had witnessed decades of the city's evolution. He wore a threadbare coat buttoned to his chin and carried a small cloth bag in gnarled hands. Elowen sprang to her feet, positioning herself between the stranger and Ashfall. Her heart hammered in her chest. Discovery meant separation, authorities taking Ashfall away, perhaps returning her to the system despite her legal adult status. Her mind raced through escape options, but the horse couldn't move quickly through Chicago in daylight. "Please," she began, her voice cracking from disuse and dehydration. "He's not hurting anything. We'll leave if—" The man raised a hand, silencing her. For a long moment, he simply studied Ashfall, his gaze traveling over the horse's powerful frame, noting the healing cuts on his legs, the proud arch of his neck. Then his eyes shifted to Elowen, taking in her thin face, the determined set of her shoulders, the protective stance she maintained despite her obvious weakness. Without a word, he placed his cloth bag on the ground, bowed slightly and turned to leave. "Wait," Elowen called. "Who are you?" The man paused, glancing back. "Takashi," he said, his voice accented but clear. "Garden was mine, before." He gestured at the overgrown space. "Many years." "I'm sorry," Elowen said quickly. "We didn't know. We can go—" "No." Takashi shook his head. "Garden sleeps now, winter, but you wake it up." His eyes moved to Ashfall again, something like wonder crossing his features. "My father raised horses in Okinawa, long time ago." He nodded toward the bag he'd left. "Water, clean, some carrots." Then he turned again, his message delivered. "Thank you," Elowen called after him, disbelief coloring her voice. "But why help us?" Takashi paused at the garden gate, considering her question. "Horses know," he said finally. "Know who to trust. This one," he gestured toward Ashfall, "chose you." With that cryptic statement, he slipped away into the morning bustle of the neighborhood. Elowen approached the bag cautiously, half expecting a trick. Inside, she found exactly what Takashi had promised: a bottle of clean water and a handful of carrots, slightly withered, but still firm and orange. Simple gifts that felt like treasure. She fed Ashfall first, smiling as he crunched the carrots with obvious delight. Only then did she allow herself small sips of the precious water, letting it soothe her parched throat. That evening, Takashi returned with more water and a small bundle of hay. He said nothing, simply nodding at them both before departing. The next morning, he brought more carrots and an old horsebrush with broken bristles. "To clean," he explained briefly, demonstrating the proper motion against Ashfall's flank before handing the brush to Elowen. "Good for blood, good for horse." Takashi became a silent guardian, visiting twice daily with small offerings. He rarely spoke more than a few words, but his presence was a comfort, proof that their secret could be kept, that kindness could exist without demands. On the fourth day, he arrived with an unexpected companion, a teenage girl with bright blue hair and multiple earrings who introduced herself as Maya. "Mr. T says you're hiding a horse," she said without preamble, her eyes widening as she spotted Ashfall. "Holy shit, you actually are. That's the most badass thing I've ever seen." Elowen tensed, but Takashi laid a reassuring hand on her arm. "Maya's grandfather, florist. 2 blocks, she brings." Maya held up a plastic bag. "Edible flowers and greens. We throw them out when they're not pretty enough to sell, but they're still good. Mr. T says horses like them. Soon Maya brought friends, Luis from the butcher shop with marrow bones that Ashfall adored, Zoe and Devin, high school seniors who stood lookout when city inspectors roamed too close, Antonio, whose grandmother owned the laundromat and could spare hot water for cleaning Ashfall's wounds. A community formed around them, an invisible alliance of neighbors who saw in Eloan and Ashfall something worth protecting, defiance against a cold world perhaps, or simply the miracle of unlikely survival. They brought what they could spare: food scraps, clean water, blankets, knowledge. My uncle worked with racehorses, Luis explained one afternoon, showing Eloan how to check Ashfall's hooves for stones or infection. This one's built for speed, probably worth a fortune. The thought had occurred to Eloan as well. Ashfall wasn't an ordinary horse. His lineage was evident in every line of his powerful body, in the intelligent gleam of his eyes, in the perfect proportions of his build. Someone, somewhere, must be looking for him, yet no one in their growing circle of allies mentioned turning him in. Instead, they helped reinforce the garden's perimeter, creating a more secure sanctuary with salvaged materials and shared labor. They brought newspapers and scanned for stories that might explain Ashfall's appearance, but found nothing specific, only a brief mention of a transportation incident involving valuable livestock on the outskirts of the city. As January deepened into February, Eloan's bond with Ashfall strengthened into something profound. She spent hours grooming him with the broken brush, singing softly as she worked. He responded to her voice with an almost supernatural awareness, coming when she called, standing guard when she slept, pressing his velvety nose against her cheek when she cried from exhaustion or hunger. "You saved me," she told him one night, her fingers tracing the white star on his forehead. "I was disappearing before you, becoming invisible." Ashfall snorted softly, his warm breath clouding in the cold air as he nudged her gently. Even in their precarious situation, something was healing in both of them, his physical wounds closing, her emotional ones beginning to mend through purpose and connection, but their fragile peace couldn't last forever. Forces beyond their control were gathering, preparing to test the limits of their unlikely bond and the strength of their newfound community. The first real challenge came with a violent storm that swept through Chicago without warning, turning snow to slush and then to treacherous ice. Rain fell in freezing sheets, soaking through the makeshift tarps protecting their corner of the garden. Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the earth beneath them. Ashfall panicked, his primal fear of storms overriding the trust he'd built with Eloan. He reared and pawed at the ground, eyes rolling white with terror as lightning split the sky. When a particularly loud thunderclap shook the air, he bolted, snapping the rope they'd fashioned to keep him from wandering too far. Eloan lunged for him, managing to grasp his mane as he charged toward the gap in the fence. "Ashfall, stop!" she screamed over the howling wind, her feet sliding on the icy ground as she struggled to hold him. For a terrifying moment, he dragged her forward, his powerful muscles straining against her grip. Eloan saw in her mind's eye what would happen if he escaped: Ashfall running wild through traffic, causing accidents, being captured or worse. "Please," she begged, rain streaming down her face as she planted her feet. "Please don't leave me." Something in her voice reached him. Ashfall stopped his frantic charge, trembling violently as another lightning flash illuminated the garden. Eloan didn't release his mane but instead moved closer, pressing her body against his heaving side. And then instinctively she began to sing. The melody rose above the storm's chaos, a wordless, haunting tune that seemed to weave between raindrops. She sang for hours as the storm raged around them, her voice sometimes barely audible over the thunder, her body soaked and shaking with cold. But she didn't stop and Ashfall didn't try to run again. He stood beside her, gradually calming under the spell of her voice, offering what warmth he could against the freezing rain. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of ice and fallen branches. Eloan was feverish, her lungs burning with each breath, but Ashfall was safe. When Takashi and Maya found them huddled together beneath a half-collapsed tarp, they immediately organized help. "You need medicine," Maya insisted, her usual bravado softened by concern, "and dry clothes, and real food." "Ashfall first," Eloan rasped, her voice nearly gone from the night's efforts. "He needs food and water." "Both," Takashi said firmly. "Both need help." For 3 days, Eloan drifted in and out of consciousness. burning with fever in the small shed they'd converted to a more habitable shelter. The community rallied. Someone brought antibiotics. Someone else offered thick blankets. Others took turns tending to Ashfall while she recovered. Through the haze of illness, Elowen was aware only of gentle hands, murmured encouragements, and the periodic visits from Ashfall, who somehow squeezed his massive head through the shed door to check on her. When her fever finally broke and she could stand again, Elowen faced a harsh reality. They couldn't continue this way. Winter would last months more, food was scarce, and her brief illness had shown how precarious their situation remained. She needed to find a way to provide for them both. The answer came through her one marketable skill, her voice. "You should sing at the L stations," Maya suggested. "People make decent money there, especially if you're good. And you're like ridiculous good." Elowen hesitated. Performing meant leaving Ashfall alone for hours, drawing attention to herself, becoming visible in a world where invisibility had been her protection. But they were already running out of options. With Takashi promising to watch over Ashfall, Elowen found a spot near the Darman Blue Line station. The acoustics were surprisingly good beneath the concrete overpass, and commuters hurried past, heads bent against the cold. Her first day yielded only $3 and some loose change, barely enough for a cheap meal, but she returned the next day and the next, gradually building confidence as she learned which songs drew people's attention, which hours brought generous listeners, which stories resonated when she spoke between melodies. She began weaving tales about the most beautiful horse in Chicago, telling fragments of their story between songs, never enough to reveal their location, but enough to intrigue. Her voice, raw with authenticity and emotion, carried stories of loss, survival, and unlikely friendship through the station's cavernous space. Slowly, people began to notice. A few regulars stopped daily, dropping dollar bills into her paint bucket drum. Some asked questions about the horse in her stories, wondering if he was real or metaphorical. Elowen kept them guessing with a mysterious smile, but her songs told deeper truths, about choosing to care for another when you have nothing left, about finding purpose in protection, about the transformative power of connection. The Ballad of Ashfall became her signature piece, a haunting melody that silenced even the most hurried commuters. She performed it daily at precisely 5:17 p.m., when the express train's rumble provided a perfect percussive backdrop, and that's when Verity first appeared. Unlike other listeners who paused briefly before continuing their journeys, Verity watched from a distance, seated at the same table in the cafe across the street each afternoon. She never approached, never donated, never reacted visibly to the music. She simply observed with sharp, assessing eyes, making notes in a small, leather-bound journal. Elowen noticed her immediately. The woman's restrained elegance stood out among the commuters, like a hawk among pigeons. Her clean-lined coat and perfectly knotted scarf spoke of wealth, but it was her focused attention that made Elowen uneasy. "There's this woman who watches me every day," she told Maya worriedly. "Just stares and takes notes, never comes closer. Probably a talent scout," Maya said with characteristic optimism, "or a music teacher. Your voice is seriously special, Ellie." But Elowen wasn't convinced. She'd spent too many years learning to read predators of all kinds. Foster parents who smiled while harboring cruelty, social workers whose clipboard notes could reshape your future, street people whose desperation could turn dangerous. Verity's gaze felt different, but no less intense. Still, the daily performances were working. By the third week, Elowen was earning enough to buy proper feed for Ashfall and occasional hot meals for herself. She even saved enough for a second-hand phone, allowing their small network of helpers to coordinate more effectively. Then came the flyers, appearing overnight on lampposts and bulletin boards throughout the neighborhood. Missing, valuable thoroughbred stallion, bay with white star marking, answers to monarch's reign, substantial reward offered. The poster included a professional photograph that was unmistakably Ashfall, or monarch's reign as his owners called him, looking regal in a sunlit paddock. The contact information led to Westlake Equestrian Center, one of the most prestigious stables in the region. Elowen stared at the flyer, heart pounding. Ashfall wasn't just valuable, he was wanted. The substantial reward meant people would be looking, hoping to claim the money. Their peaceful existence was about to become much more complicated. That evening, Verity broke her pattern. Instead of watching from afar, she approached Elowen after the Ballad of Ashfall. her heels clicking precisely on the concrete. "You have an extraordinary gift," Verity said without introduction, her voice cultured and confident. "But more impressively, you have an extraordinary horse. I'd like to talk to you about Monarch's Reign." Elowen froze, her fingers tightening around the handle of her paint bucket. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said carefully, already calculating escape routes and what few possessions she could grab before they had to flee the garden. Verity's lips curved in a slight smile. "I've been listening to your songs for 3 weeks. The details are too specific to be invention." She removed a business card from her coat pocket and extended it. "Verity Chandler, equine specialist, Chicago Tribune. I'm not here to take him away. I'm here because I think your story deserves to be told properly." Elowen didn't take the card. "There's no story, they're just songs." 3 months ago, Verity continued undeterred, a trailer transporting valuable racehorses from Kentucky to Wisconsin overturned on the highway just outside Chicago. 2 horses were recovered immediately. The third, Monarch's Reign, valued at over $300,000, vanished without a trace. Elowen's heart hammered, but she kept her expression neutral. "Sounds like a news story you've already covered." "What's fascinating," Verity pressed, "is that despite extensive searches, helicopter sweeps, and a substantial reward, no one found a 16-hand thoroughbred stallion in Chicago. It should have been impossible for such an animal to simply disappear." She paused. "Unless someone who knew how to be invisible was hiding him." The precision of her words sent a chill through Elowen. This woman had clearly been investigating for weeks, connecting dots, following threads. "What do you want?" Elowen asked finally. "I want the truth," Verity said simply. "And I think you need help. Real help, not just scraps and goodwill from neighbors. That horse is suffering from exposure and inadequate care no matter how much you love him." Anger flared in Elowen's chest. "You don't know anything about us. He was dying when I found him. I gave him my only blanket. I go hungry so he can eat. Everyone else walked past him, but I stayed." "I know," Verity said quietly. "That's precisely what makes this story important." She extended the card again. "I'm not asking you to reveal his location now. Think about it. Call me when you're ready to talk. But understand this, those flyers mean others are looking too, and not everyone has your best interests at heart." This time, Elowen took the card, tucking it into her pocket without looking at it. "I have to go." Verity nodded. "Be careful. Valuable horses attract desperate people." The warning proved prophetic. 3 nights later, as Elowen and Ashfall moved between hiding spots, a precaution they'd adopted since the flyers appeared, they were ambushed in an alley behind a warehouse on the Lower West Side. 3 men emerged from the shadows, blocking both ends of the narrow passage. "So that horse is worth a fortune on the black market," said the largest, uncoiling a rope with practiced hands. "And you should have called the cops when you found him, girl." Elowen stepped protectively in front of Ashfall, her pulse pounding. "He's not for sale or stealing, back off." "This isn't a negotiation," said another man, moving closer. "Walk away now, you won't get hurt." Ashfall sensed the threat immediately. With a shrill whinny, he rose on his hind legs, massive hooves pawing the air. When he came down, the concrete seemed to tremble beneath them. The men hesitated, but didn't retreat. The leader raised his rope. "We're taking him one way or another." What followed was chaos. Ashfall charging, men shouting, Elowen grabbing a discarded pipe to defend them both. In the frenzy, Ashfall slammed into a steel beam, slicing open his foreleg. Blood stained the snow beneath them. The injury changed the dynamic instantly. One man cursed, backing away. "Die damaged goods ain't worth the trouble," he muttered. The others followed reluctantly, disappearing into the shadows with promises to return. Elowen dropped to her knees beside Ashfall, panic rising as she assessed the wound. It was deep, not life-threatening if properly treated, but dangerous in their circumstances. Without supplies or knowledge, infection would set in quickly. "Stay with me," she whispered, tearing strips from her shirt to fashion a crude bandage. "Please stay with me." All night she kept pressure on the wound, humming softly, adjusting the makeshift tourniquet. By dawn, Ashfall was feverish, his eyes dull with pain. Elowen knew they'd reached a breaking point. Her love wasn't enough anymore. He needed professional care. With trembling fingers, she retrieved Verity's card and made the call. "I need help," she said, when the journalist answered. "Ashfall's hurt, and I can't fix it." Verity's response was immediate. "Guy, where are you?" 2 hours later, a nondescript van pulled into the alley. From it emerged Verity, and a middle-aged man carrying a medical bag. "This is Dr. Reeves," Verity explained. "He specializes in equine medicine and owes me several favors. He's here to help, not report." "Doctor." Reeves approached Ashfall cautiously, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Magnificent animal," he murmured, examining the wound. "You've done well keeping him alive this long." While he worked, cleaning and stitching the deep cut, Verity spoke quietly to Elowen. "You've been extraordinary, but this can't continue. He needs proper shelter, consistent food, medical care. You need those things too." Elowen watched anxiously as the vet administered antibiotics. "I can't lose him. He's all I have." "That's why I have a proposition," Verity said. "I want to write your story. The full truth about how an 18-year-old homeless girl saved a valuable racehorse and kept him hidden in plain sight through the worst winter in decades." Elowen shook her head. "They'll take him away." "Not necessarily." Verity's expression softened. "What you've done is technically illegal, but it's also undeniably heroic. Public opinion is a powerful force. If we tell this right, it could change both your lives." "How?" Elowen asked, desperation edging her voice. "Trust me," Verity said, "and trust that Monarch's Reign's owners might surprise you. They've been searching for months, not just for a valuable animal, but for a horse they genuinely love." As dawn broke over the city, painting the dingy alley in gold, Elowen made the hardest decision of her life. She agreed to Verity's proposition, knowing it might mean losing Ashfall forever, but understanding that true love sometimes meant letting go. The article appeared on Sunday's front page, "The Girl Who Whispered to Horses: How Chicago's Homeless Teen Saved a Champion Thoroughbred." Verity's storytelling was masterful, weaving Elowen's history of foster care abandonment with Ashfall's dramatic escape from the overturned trailer. She detailed their improbable survival through Chicago's harshest winter, the blanket sacrifice, the community that formed around them, the nightly songs at the L station. Photographs accompanied the text. Ashfall in their garden sanctuary, Elowen singing with her paint bucket drum, the two together sharing a quiet moment. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By noon, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By evening, Elowen's name was trending on social media, with thousands sharing the article and demanding better support for both former foster youth and animal welfare. The garden became a gathering place for well-wishers bringing gifts and offers of help. Takashi, Maya, and their other allies served as gatekeepers, protecting Elowen and Ashfall from the sudden onslaught of attention. 3 days after the article's publication, a sleek black car pulled up outside the garden. From it emerged two people, a tall silver-haired woman in riding clothes and a younger man in a wheelchair. Verity, who had barely left Elowen's side since the publication, stepped forward to meet them. "Mrs. Harrington, Mr. Harrington, thank you for coming personally." Elowen stood frozen beside Ashfall, one hand buried in his mane for strength. These were the owners, Catherine Harrington, founder of Westlake Equestrian Center, and her son James, a former Olympic equestrian whose career had ended in a devastating riding accident 3 years earlier. Catherine approached slowly, her eyes fixed on Ashfall. "Monarch," she breathed, using his registered name. The horse's ears perked forward at the familiar voice, but he didn't move from Elowen's side. James wheeled closer, his expression complex. "We've been searching for months," he said quietly. "We never gave up hope, but as time passed without any sightings, it seemed impossible he could have survived in the city, especially in this winter." Catherine turned her attention to Elowen, really seeing her for the first time. The girl was thin, her clothes worn and patched, dark circles beneath her eyes speaking of months of constant vigilance, yet she stood tall, protective and fierce beside the animal she'd saved. "You gave him your blanket," Catherine said, her voice catching. "When you had nothing else to give." Elowen nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This was it, the moment she'd lose Ashfall forever. These wealthy, powerful people had come to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. She'd known this day would come, had agreed to it even, but the reality was crushing. "So may I?" James asked, gesturing toward Ashfall. At Elowen's hesitant nod, he wheeled closer to the horse, extending his hand, palm up. Ashfall studied James cautiously, then stretched his neck to sniff the familiar scent. After a moment, he gave a soft, nickering sound of recognition, gently bumping his muzzle against James's outstretched fingers. "Son, he remembers," James said, smiling as he stroked the velvet nose. He was my partner before the accident. We trained together for years. Monarch Ashfall has a special lineage, Catherine explained to Elowen. His bloodline carries unusual intelligence and loyalty, traits that can't be measured in dollar values or race victories. When James could no longer ride competitively, Monarch seemed to lose his spirit too. We were transporting him to a specialized breeding program, hoping to give him new purpose. Elowen nodded, understanding all too well the feeling of losing purpose. She'd experienced it herself upon aging out of foster care, that sudden disorienting sense of having no place or function in the world. We've read Miss Chandler's article several times, Catherine continued. The bond you've formed with him is extraordinary. Some might call it miraculous. Elowen swallowed hard. I understand you need to take him back. He deserves proper care, a warm stable, enough food. Her voice broke. I always knew I couldn't keep him forever. James and Catherine exchanged a look, laden with unspoken communication. Actually, James said, we've been discussing an alternative arrangement on the drive here. Catherine nodded. Our facility needs someone with your unique abilities, someone who understands horses on an instinctive level, who can sing to them during storms, who puts their needs before her own. Elowen blinked, not comprehending. We'd like to offer you a position at Westlake, Catherine said clearly. Housing on the grounds, fair wages, training in professional equine care, and continued contact with Ashfall, of course. You want to hire me? Elowen whispered, disbelief coloring each word. More than that, James added. We want to sponsor you. Education if you want it. Musical training for that remarkable voice. So a fresh start. Why? The question escaped before Elowen could stop it. After a lifetime of being discarded and overlooked, such generosity seemed impossible to trust. Because talent deserves nurturing, Catherine said simply. Because loyalty should be rewarded. Because anyone who would give their only blanket to a frightened horse deserves the same compassion in return. James wheeled slightly closer. And because Monarch clearly chose you, he added softly. In our world, that means something. Tears spilled down Elowen's cheeks as the full impact of their offer registered. Not just a job, but a future. Not just keeping Ashfall in her life, but building a life where more animals might benefit from her gifts. There's one condition, Catherine added, her tone growing serious. You tell your story to everyone. Children in foster care, equine therapy programs, wherever it might help others understand the power of compassion and connection. Elowen looked at Ashfall, remembering that frozen night beneath the bridge when she'd draped her only protection over his shivering body. How that one act of kindness, when she had nothing left to give, had somehow returned to her multiplied beyond imagination. I can do that, she promised, her voice stronger now. The transition wasn't instant or easy. Leaving the garden sanctuary felt like abandoning a battlefield where they'd fought for survival. Elowen insisted on thanking each person who had helped them, Takashi, Maya, Luis, and dozens of others who had contributed to their unlikely survival. The Harringtons, impressed by the community's devotion, established a neighborhood fund to support the garden's restoration and other local projects. Ashfall's arrival at Westlake caused a sensation. News crews captured his triumphant return, focusing equally on the magnificent horse and the girl who had saved him. Elowen, uncomfortable with the attention, found refuge in the stables, where other horses responded to her voice just as Ashfall had. Spring came gradually to Chicago, melting away the brutal winter that had tested them so severely. At Westlake, Ashfall's coat regained its gleaming health, his injuries healed completely, and his spirit flourished. Elowen, too, transformed, proper nutrition filling out her thin frame, regular sleep erasing the dark circles beneath her eyes, education expanding her horizons beyond day-to-day survival. Most evenings found her in Ashfall's stall, singing softly as she groomed him, their bond unchanging despite their changed circumstances. Sometimes James joined them, sharing stories of his competitive days with Monarch and teaching Elowen the finer points of horsemanship. On warm nights when the stars emerged above the sprawling grounds of Westlake, Elowen would sometimes take Ashfall for gentle rides across the moonlit paddocks. During one such night, as summer approached and fireflies dotted the darkness like earthbound stars, she noticed something new, a small white marking on Ashfall's foreleg, precisely where his worst injury had healed. The scar had grown in white against his bay coat, forming a perfect star that matched the one on his forehead. Elowen traced it gently, recognizing it as a permanent reminder of their journey together. the pain they'd endured and the healing they'd found. "2 stars now," she whispered against his neck. "One you were born with, one you earned." Ashfall nickered softly in response, pressing his warm muzzle against her cheek in the gesture that had become their private communication. In that quiet moment, under a canopy of real stars, Elowen understood that some bonds transcend explanation. They simply exist, connecting souls across seemingly impossible divides. Her life had transformed from one of constant fear and scarcity to one of purpose and possibility, all because she'd chosen compassion when she had nothing else to give. The blanket she'd sacrificed that frozen night had returned to her 100-fold, in security, in opportunity, in connection. Each day brought new challenges and learnings at Westlake. Elowen studied equine medicine, practiced her music formally for the first time, and gradually opened herself to friendship with the other staff. Her past remained part of her, but no longer defined her limits. And always at the center of everything was Ashfall, the magnificent creature who had found her when they both were lost, who had recognized in her a kindred spirit worth trusting. Together, they had survived the impossible. Together, they would thrive in the possible. Each morning, as dawn broke over Westlake's rolling pastures, Elowen would visit Ashfall first, resting her forehead against his, their breath mingling in the quiet moment before the day began. "Thank you," she would whisper, meaning everything that words couldn't fully express: gratitude for his trust, for the community he had brought into her life, for the future they now shared. And always, without fail, Ashfall would respond with that gentle bump of his muzzle against her cheek, as if to say that some gifts require no thanks, only the courage to accept them and the wisdom to pass them on.